Today, we're journeying into the unknown to determine for the first time in forever what might have caused a 62-year-old mystery where a group of mountaineers got lost in the woods when they most definitely did not want to build a snowman. And even though they tried to do the next right thing, sometimes you just can't win. However, after this publication, hopefully all of the conspiracy theorists will be able to just let it go.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 33 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the STEMULUS. I'm Steph Evs, and here's what happened this week in STEM. Back in January 1959, a group of Russian mountaineers consisting of 9 students and their sports instructor set out on a 200-mile skiing expedition in the Ural Mountains. And aside from one student who turned back with joint pain, none of them were ever seen alive again. According to camera film and the group's personal diaries, they made camp on the slopes of Polat Siekol on February 1st. The indigenous Mansi people refer to this mountain as Dead Mountain, so that's about as blunt of an instance of foreshadowing as you could get. This was the last recording of any type before disaster struck. This event became known as the Dyatlov Pass incident, and it wasn't until a few months later that the bodies were found by a Soviet criminal investigation team. The circumstances they found them in were strange. They found the expedition tent sticking out of the snow, apparently cut from the inside. The next day, they found the first bodies near a cedar tree, and as the snow thawed, more bodies were found at scattered locations around the slope of the mountain. The states that their bodies were in were also mysterious. Several of them were in various states of undress, some had their skulls and chests smashed open, and others were missing eyes or a tongue. The investigation team concluded at the time that the men and women in the group had died from a compelling natural force, although they couldn't point to what exactly that force was, at least not until now. Over the years, several theories have been tossed out as potential candidates for this compelling natural force, but none of them have proved to hold water, or in this case, snow, I guess. The original theory in 1959 was that an avalanche was the most likely culprit for the Dyatlov Pass incident, but there really wasn't data to back up this theory. The camp was on a slope with what was thought to be too mild of an incline for an avalanche, snow didn't fall the night of February 1st, and most of the trauma to the bodies was not something you typically see with avalanche victims. On top of all that, there's at least a 9-hour gap between the time the team made camp and the time when the event occurred. People have speculated on everything from Soviet military operations to Yetis or aliens to explain this incident. Shockingly, it was a different sort of fictional character that would play a significant role in solving this mystery. These guys. In 2019, geotechnical engineer Alexander Puzrin met Johann Gom, the head of the Snow Avalanche Simulation Laboratory at EPFL, and the two of them began circling back to the original 1959 avalanche theory. Puzrin and Gom decided to work together to create analytical models and computer simulations to see if they could recreate what happened during that 9-hour gap. As the two researchers began closer analyzing the incident, they found some aspects of the event were different than what had been initially believed. The snowfall in the area made the slope appear shallower than it actually was. In reality, the slope was closer to 30 degrees, which is considered to be the minimum threshold for many avalanches. In addition, there was an underlying snow layer on the mountain that hadn't really clumped together, which created a weak, slippery base that would have been ideal for a large amount of snow and an overlying layer to slide over during what's known as a slab avalanche. I've included a video in my sources if you'd like to hear Johann himself explain it in more detail. Another problem you may recall with the original avalanche theory was that there wasn't really any snowfall the night before the incident, and with avalanches, large amounts of snow are kind of necessary. The mountaineers likely destabilized the slope when they cut into the snow to pitch their tent for the night, but they still would have needed a lot more snow to accumulate before they could have triggered an avalanche. While there wasn't any snow in the weather reports from that night, there were very strong winds. These winds were likely what's known as katabatic winds, which are heavy clumps of really cold air that tend to bring large amounts of snow from higher altitudes downwards, in this case, down towards the campsite. This could potentially account for the 9-hour delay between the time the mountaineers set up camp and the actual avalanche. Enter Frozen. Gom had been impressed by the movement of the snow when he first saw the movie in 2013, and had asked the animators how they'd done it. After meeting with one of the specialists on the team, Gom took the snow animation code used on Frozen and modified it to be used for his avalanche simulation models to try and figure out what had happened to the mountaineers. But there was still one big question that needed answering. What kind of forces and pressures could cause the blunt force trauma injuries that were seen on the mountaineers' bodies? Typically, avalanche victims die from suffocation, so what made this avalanche so different? They needed a little bit more info for their code, and for this, they turned to the automotive industry. Back in the 1970s, General Motors broke the ribs on 100 different cadavers by hitting them with a range of weights at different velocities to try and simulate what happened during car crashes. While this entire experiment sounds pretty gruesome, it actually had a really good purpose. The data from the study was used to calibrate the safety of seatbelts. The thing that Gohm and Puzrin were most interested in was the data differences between the cadavers that were rigidly braced and the ones that weren't. The reason they were interested in this data was because the mountaineers would have placed their bedding on top of their skis, which meant that they would have been rigidly braced when the avalanche struck, so the data for the rigidly braced cadavers could be used to calibrate their impact models. What the researchers found was that a 16-foot-long slab of snow could cause the injuries consistent with what was seen in the Dyatlov Pass incident. These injuries wouldn't have been fatal, or at least not immediately. What the researchers found was that when they combined the two simulations, the data did indeed point towards a weirdly tiny delayed avalanche as the most likely culprit behind the fate of the mountaineers. What likely occurred was that after the avalanche struck, the team cut themselves out of the tent and started to make their way down towards the tree line that was about a mile away in the hopes of finding temporary shelter there. Some of them were pretty badly hurt, so it's likely the less injured members of the team dragged them out of the shelter and pulled them along as far as they could. Unfortunately, the odds were stacked against them, and most of the members of the team wound up succumbing to hypothermia, and the others died from their injuries. It was an incredibly rare event that only could have taken place with those exact conditions, and it turns out those conditions were the perfect recipe for disaster. There are still some portions of the Dyatlov Pass incident that don't have explanations, at least not yet. For example, no one is quite sure why some of the bodies were found half undressed or why some of them were slightly radioactive. One possible explanation for the radioactivity is the lanterns that the team would have used, which contained thorium, a radioactive metal. The missing eyes and tongue were likely just snacks for scavenging animals, but that too hasn't been definitively confirmed. Maybe someday we'll have explanations for those things, but as of right now, we at least know the likely cause of the tragic incident. Turns out, movie magic can sometimes help solve a 62-year-old mystery. Who would have thunk? So that brings us to our question of the day. Since a lot of today's story revolved around tragedy, let's go out on a light note. If Olaf were to enter a STEM field, what do you think he'd pick as a career? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you want to learn more about the story I talked about, I'll include links to all of my sources in the description down below, along with links to all of my social media and my Patreon page, so please check that out in your free time. If you're new here and you find my terrible jokes and geekery tolerable, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on any of my future content. I'm always looking for current STEM-related news stories to cover, so if you see any that spark your interest, send me a link on any of my social media pages using the hashtag #Twistem, and it just might make it into an episode. But with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Stay well, stay awesome, and I will see you next time. It's good to be back!